The rain fell in a constant electric hiss, blurring the fractured horizon of the Baikonur array. Floodlights flickered against a gray expanse of wreckage where towers once reached into the upper atmosphere. Armored figures moved through the mire like ghosts in metallic shells, their movements purposeful, their silence heavy. Above them, the sky pulsed with faint auroral light, a shimmering veil that had not existed a week before. It was the echo of an event still without name or understanding. The world had watched it unfold on orbital feeds, a breach in the upper layers of reality, and now the aftershock hummed through everything built by human hands. Commander Alara Vance stood beneath the shattered dome of an observation platform, the wind clawing at her armor. The hollowed shell of what had been the world's largest quantum research site stretched before her like a wounded machine. Around her, portable reactors growled under strain, feeding a cluster of salvaged monitors that struggled to keep a signal alive. Across their flickering screens ran a pattern too steady to be noise, too chaotic to be language, a geometry of interference locked above the Earth like an unseen pulse. Those who had witnessed it firsthand called it the Veil. Every signal the outpost gathered bent around that region. Instruments misfired, drones vanished from telemetry, and timestamps refused to hold. Even the air felt wrong. The technicians tried to measure its composition, but the data changed with every pass, as if the atmosphere itself was remembering and forgetting what it was supposed to be. Alara's team had gone out earlier that morning to probe the outer boundary, their sensors tuned to catch the smallest ripple. She had warned them about the energy spikes, the resonance fields, the magnetic distortion that seemed to erase matter instead of destroying it. They had acknowledged, confident as all good soldiers were, in their preparation. She had watched their signals crawl across the display until one of them, the transponder belonging to Captain Orion Cade, sank into silence. No static, no detonation, no signature of failure. Only an absence where a human heartbeat should have been. Around her, the operations team had tried to recover the feed. The result was only a recursive loop of the same 3 seconds, repeating out of order, as though the signal itself had been folded into another shape. She had seen her staff exchange uneasy glances and had ordered them to hold position, unwilling to lose more people to uncertainty. In the far corner of the command tent, Dr. Jin Rao had studied the readings in stillness. Her notebooks were lined with graphite sketches of wave functions drawn by hand, because she did not trust the corrupted data streams. Her eyes had flicked over numbers that no longer belonged to known physics, her mind parsing a structure that resembled a pattern of interference between worlds. When she had finally turned toward Alara, the weight of comprehension had already hollowed her expression. She had seen what none of them wanted to admit, that the veil was not a boundary at all, but a crossing. The confirmation came hours later when the Earth itself began to hum. The light over the valley thickened into a pale corona, and an object descended through it. It moved without acceleration, as though gravity no longer mattered. The impact shook the remains of the array, and for a moment, everyone thought it was another satellite falling from orbit. But the wreckage bore markings that belonged to their own research division, and the serial number stamped on its frame referenced a production cycle that had not yet begun. Inside, they found a data core sealed in polymer, still active despite the re-entry burn. Its timestamp read April 2027. The recordings embedded within it showed images of their own facility, their own operations, 2 years ahead of the present. Among those fragments was a brief reflection of Commander Vance herself, giving orders that had never been spoken. The realization settled like frost through the camp. Time had begun to speak back. Within 24 hours, the remnants of the array were evacuated. The Directorate reconstituted itself underground, a command structure cobbled from nations too frightened to remain separate. They named their new post the Raven Bunker. The walls were lined with salvaged alloy, the air thick with the scent of coolant and burnt metal. The scientists worked without sleep, dissecting the data core while soldiers reinforced the perimeter above. They found fragments of a program once conceived but never finished. Project Q-Gate, an experimental attempt to stabilize long-range quantum entanglement. Jinro recognized her own work buried in its encryption. Years earlier, her prototype had failed catastrophically, claiming the lives of 9 technicians when the magnetic field imploded. The project had been buried under classification, its name erased. Yet here it was again, perfected, refined, and apparently operational, sent from somewhere that had continued what they could not. The implications reached far beyond technology. The presence of that device suggested another version of humanity, parallel in evolution but divergent in choice, reaching across the multiversal divide. Whether their intent was benevolent or hostile, no one could agree. Colonel Rafe Danner, the Directorate's liaison from the Northern Defense Command, had argued that any unknown contact capable of such interference was a threat. Others insisted it was communication, not invasion. The debate had raged for hours, until Alara proposed a reconnaissance incursion through the Veil's perimeter. Containment required knowledge, and knowledge required risk. The proposal passed. She was placed in command of the Raven Division, a composite task force drawn from multiple nations, trained for electronic warfare and asymmetric operations. The mission was simple in words and impossible in execution. Enter the distortion, recover data, and return. When they moved at dawn, the aurora above the steppe shimmered like a wound healing backward. The terrain within the exclusion zone had twisted. Structures appeared where none existed, their geometry warped, their shadows refusing to align with the light. Machines failed without warning. Drones spun out of control as if pulled by invisible hands. Each step forward felt heavier, as though gravity thickened near the heart of the phenomenon. Jin rode in the rear of the convoy. Her instruments clutched to her chest, scanning fluctuations invisible to the naked eye. The readings grew denser, their peaks aligning into a rhythm like breath. It was as though the veil was alive and waiting. When the team reached the crater that had once held the fallen satellite, the ground vibrated beneath their boots. The air bent light around it. In the space of a heartbeat, the landscape inverted. Vision fractured into overlapping frames, colors bleeding into one another, sound becoming a pressure more than a wave. Every soldier felt themselves displaced and yet anchored, suspended in a moment that refused to end. Then, as suddenly as it began, the distortion cleared. What surrounded them was not their world. The same valley stretched before them, but the sky was clearer, the air sharper. Where there had been desolation, there now rose a city, a living reflection of a place they had never built. Towers gleamed in the distance, pulsing with clean light. The team's navigation systems registered their coordinates as unchanged, yet the terrain belonged to another future. They realized they had crossed through. The new environment hummed with quiet machinery. Drones, shaped like mirrors, drifted across the skyline, their movement silent, their scanning beams tracing the intruders with detached precision. Every piece of recovered debris, every grain of soil, bore differences measurable only under a scientist's eye, but tangible in feel. As night fell, the team established a defensive camp amid the ruins of what appeared to be their own base, replicated and abandoned. The architecture was identical down to the arrangement of support beams, but the materials carried an unfamiliar resonance. Jin documented everything, while Alara ordered her soldiers to maintain perimeter discipline. The silence of the alien steppe pressed close, and every breath felt borrowed. Then came the signal. At first, it was a whisper through the calm static, indistinct and fractured. Then it formed into a voice. Its modulation matched Captain Cade's identification codes. The voice carried urgency and fear. The message, though broken, warned them that they were standing in the collapse point of two converging realities. It urged retreat, claiming that remaining would doom both sides. The transmission cut before they could verify it. Moments later, the horizon flared. The aurora above the city condensed into a single luminous thread descending toward the earth. The ground trembled with resonance. The soldiers braced as shadows emerged along a ridgeline, human shapes in armor almost identical to their own. Weapons gleamed faintly, edges of another civilization reflected against the dark. From their movements, from the precision of their formation, it was clear these were not strangers, but counterparts. Alara advanced cautiously, her gaze fixed on the leading figure among the others, a soldier whose every gesture mirrored her own. The resemblance tightened into certainty. The opposing commander bore her face, older by years, and scarred by choices not yet made. The twin figure stood silent amid the shimmer of distortion, her expression one of grim recognition. Across the valley, the air thickened once more. The distortion began to collapse inward. The twin raised a gloved hand in warning, a gesture of command without words. The meaning was unmistakable. Alara understood it as a demand to retreat before convergence solidified. Then the first explosion broke the stillness. Railgun fire streaked across the night, carving lines of incandescent plasma through air that no longer obeyed physics. The mirrored soldiers scattered, returning fire from unseen positions. The camp dissolved into chaos. Reality itself fragmented as echoes of both forces appeared half a second ahead or behind their own actions. Like time struggling to decide which moment was real, Alara's unit fought its way back toward the breach, moving through terrain that flickered between existence and absence. Jin's instruments overloaded, their readings meaningless. The veil above spiraled into a cyclone of light, pulling matter upward in ribbons of luminescent dust. In the storm's heart, fragments of Cade's voice surfaced again through the collapsing frequencies, urging them toward an unknown failsafe, insisting that the signal they had found held the key to survival. The words were lost in the roar of collapsing dimensions. Alara reached the breach point and triggered the emergency detonator. A last resort meant to collapse the field generator and sever the connection between worlds. The device ignited in a pulse of white fire that consumed sight and sound alike. When the light faded, the team found themselves back on their side of the veil. The terrain was scorched, the equipment ruined, 2 soldiers missing. The sky above was fractured by a single, lingering arc of light. The phenomenon had not ended. Alara removed her helmet and breathed the heavy air, tasting the metallic residue of the anomaly. Around her, the surviving soldiers gathered in silence, their faces streaked with sweat and disbelief. Jin reported that the field was still active, that the oscillations were growing rather than fading. The commander's eyes fixed on the horizon where the aurora began to throb once more, stronger, faster, alive with the rhythm of something vast and waking. Fatigue and dread anchored every thought, yet beneath it all lived a single defiant certainty. They had crossed once, and they would cross again. The unknown had drawn first blood, but humanity had never retreated from what it could not yet understand. Alara felt the pull of purpose settle into her bones. Whatever waited beyond the veil, they would meet it on their own terms. The sky trembled with distant thunder as she turned toward the valley, readying for what would come next. The light of the anomaly still lingered over the horizon, a low burning arc that refused to fade. The soldiers of Raven Division moved through the wreckage of their own equipment, repairing what could be saved, burying what could not. The ground remained warm beneath their boots, as though the soil itself had absorbed the pulse of what they had unleashed. Above them, the aurora pulsed in rhythmic intervals, slower now but deeper, like the heartbeat of something immense and patient. Commander Alara Vance stood on the rise overlooking the crater that had once marked the Veil's edge. Every sensor was dead, every instrument blind. Only the naked eye could see the distortion, a faint ripple in the air where space refused to sit still. The weight of the silence pressed against her chest. In that quiet, she could almost feel the echo of herself from the other side watching back. And when dawn came, it broke across a landscape that no longer belonged entirely to one world. Dust hovered without falling. The clouds rippled sideways. The sunrise bled through color spectrums unseen by human eyes. The event had changed not just the land, but the laws governing it. Engineers reported temporal drift in their chronometers. Local compasses spun in slow, constant circles. The environment itself seemed to vibrate with potential energy, unstable yet contained. In the underground command structure, the Directorate convened again under emergency protocol. The faces around the table were pale, sleepless, and shaken. They had reviewed the recovered data and the limited reports from the surviving field cameras. Each recording was fractured, overlapping with frames of unfamiliar terrain and distorted reflections of the same soldiers performing different movements, a fraction of a second apart. The footage offered no answers, only confirmation that reality had been breached. The leadership's deliberations dissolved into silence when they realized what it meant. If the veil was an interface, it could open both ways. Alara spent the following hours walking the perimeter, her armor dented and darkened by exposure. Her mind replayed the last moments before the detonation, the image of her alternate self standing on that ridge with the weight of entire worlds in her expression. There had been no malice in that other face, only recognition and warning. The implication gnawed at her. The enemy might not be the other side at all, but the consequence of two civilizations touching across incompatible physics. Dr. Jin Rao worked in the bunker's lower lab, the only place shielded enough to run diagnostics on what little remained of her instruments. The data core retrieved from the earlier crash still pulsed faintly with residual energy. She had extracted fragments of code that seemed to rewrite themselves whenever observed, self-modifying algorithms encoded in probability instead of logic. Her hands trembled as she realized it was not just a message, it was a living computation, a seed of the multiverse rendered in machine form. For the Directorate, patience had run out. They saw movement near the anomaly in satellite footage, irregular flashes of light like beacons. Something, or someone, was sending signals from the other side. Colonel Danner authorized a containment escalation. If communication was possible, so was infiltration. A temporary wall of automated sentry units and quantum dampers was established around the crater. The field hummed with invisible power, locking down every measurable particle of space. The soldiers stationed there spoke little, their nerves frayed by days of static whispers filtering through their comms. The noise resembled voices, speaking backward, syllables stretched by light delay. Some swore they could hear their own names echoing through it. Alara knew fear could spread faster than any contagion. She rotated the guards, maintained protocol, and reported stability that did not exist. In truth, the air itself carried unease. The veil pulsed every few hours, as though breathing. When it did, all electronics within a kilometer flickered. Lights dimmed, weapon systems reset, and the temperature dropped to freezing despite the summer heat. The Earth was holding its breath with them. 3 days passed. Then came the first sign of change. At Oro 200 hours, the energy monitors registered a new frequency. It moved like a signal trying to align with their systems. Jin traced it through the comm grid and found it matched the spectral pattern of human brain activity. The anomaly was mimicking them, reflecting the patterns of consciousness like sonar returning an image. Her discovery spread through the bunker in whispers. If the veil could mirror human thought, it could understand intention. The Directorate split into factions overnight. Some argued for communication, believing the entity, or entities, beyond might be attempting contact. Others demanded preemptive containment, fearing a psychic contagion that could rewrite cognition itself. The compromise was brittle, observation without interaction, but the choice did not remain theirs for long. By the fourth night, the perimeter sensors failed completely. Patrol drones sent to repair them never returned. When recovery teams ventured out at dawn, they found the machines scattered across the steppe, their hulls intact, but their internal systems rearranged. Components had fused in configurations that defied human assembly, as though remade according to a different logic. The word contamination began appearing in internal reports. In the following hours, subtle anomalies multiplied. Soldiers reported glimpsing shadows of themselves performing different actions a few seconds before or after they occurred. Time within the containment zone stretched and contracted unpredictably. A soldier could fire a rifle and watch the muzzle flash unfold in slow motion, while his own pulse quickened to unbearable speed. The human brain was not built for that kind of perception. Men began to break. Alara requested reinforcement and authorization for a tactical withdrawal, but the Directorate refused. The political cost of admitting loss was greater than the risk of collapse. They demanded results, proof that the threat could be contained. The pressure transformed the base into a crucible of exhaustion and fear. In the chaos, Jin made a discovery she could not ignore. The self-modifying code within the data core had begun to synchronize with the readings from the veil. It was as if the two were parts of the same system, one physical, one informational. The core's pulses aligned with the energy fluctuations in the crater, matching rhythm for rhythm. She realized it was not just a message from another reality, it was a bridgehead. The future version of humanity had built a stabilizer to control the veil, and that stabilizer had survived its own collapse long enough to reach them. If she could understand its architecture, she might close the breach or open it completely. She went to Alara with her findings, her mind raw from sleeplessness. The commander listened in silence, her gaze fixed on the pulsing light over the horizon. Alara had already accepted what the Directorate could not. The phenomenon would not be caged. It was evolving faster than human understanding, adapting to observation itself. The decision to act came quietly. Alara ordered a covert reactivation of the field generators they had once used to cross over. If the enemy or counterpart was moving on their side, she intended to intercept it before it reached them. The plan was desperate, improvised, but it was the only one left that preserved initiative. As the team prepared, the storm above the veil intensified. Lightning crawled horizontally through the clouds, illuminating the night in white pulses. The air crackled with a taste like burnt copper. Instruments went blind again. The soldiers checked their armor seals, manually. Every movement carried the weight of finality. At 0 hour, the generators flared. The world bent. Crossing a second time was not like the first. The distortion no longer resisted them. It accepted their passage. Space folded around their convoy like a closing fist, and gravity vanished. The vehicles emerged into stillness. The city they had seen before lay in ruins now, its towers split into translucent layers, each one slightly out of sync with the next. The horizon shimmered as though seen through heat, but the air was cold enough to burn the lungs. They moved in cautious formation. The silence was absolute. What remained of the alternate civilization stood frozen in time. Lights flickered in the distance, some mechanical, others organic. It was impossible to tell. Every sound they made returned as an echo delayed by seconds, overlapping with itself. Alara surveyed the devastation. The other world had fallen not to war, but to collapse. The same resonance tearing through their own dimension had already consumed this one. She could feel the unstable ground vibrating under her boots. Reality was thinner here, stretched to translucence. Jin studied her instruments in disbelief. The quantum frequencies she detected were identical to those recorded on their side, but magnified tenfold. This place was a reflection of what awaited them if the veil continued to expand unchecked. She realized the truth too late. Their arrival had reactivated whatever dormant process had frozen the collapse. In the center of the dead city, a tower still stood intact. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the data core she carried. The architecture was unfamiliar, yet unmistakably human. It called to them like gravity. As the team advanced, shadows moved along the periphery. At first they seemed like tricks of the eye, reflections or distortions, but then shapes emerged, armor-clad, moving with purpose. The soldiers tensed. The figures were human, but their motion was wrong, synchronized beyond coordination, as if directed by a single consciousness distributed among them. The shapes closed in silently. The team tightened formation, rifles raised, no words exchanged. The first ripple of distortion hit them like wind without air. The attackers advanced, their armor marked with sigils derived from the Directorate's own insignia, altered by time and interpretation. It was the Raven division of another timeline, fused into one entity. Alara fired first. The return was immediate. Bolts of coherent plasma tore through the haze, distorting light around them. The fight was soundless but violent. Each impact fractured the environment further. Buildings collapsed without falling, walls folding into themselves like reflections in broken glass. The air became a storm of intersecting possibilities. Jin struggled to keep her focus. Her readings spiked with each exchange. Every act of violence amplified the resonance. The multiverse reacted to human will like a tuning fork struck by chaos. She realized the battle itself was feeding the collapse. Alara understood it too late. She signaled retreat, but the exits no longer existed. The veil had sealed around them, trapping both sides in a closed loop of reality. The only chance left lay in the tower at the city's heart, the beacon still pulsing with quantum rhythm. They fought toward it, step by step, through the disintegrating city. The light around them fractured into ribbons, each one showing glimpses of other versions of the same fight, other outcomes, other failures. Every possibility screamed across the spectrum at once. The line between worlds vanished. When they reached the tower's base, the world trembled. The structure's core opened like an iris, revealing a sphere of energy identical to the data core, but vast enough to swallow a human. Jin recognized it instantly. It was the control system, the heart of the stabilizer, the thing her future self must have built to anchor the multiverse. The soldiers behind her were falling one by one into the collapsing ground, their bodies stretching into light as the physics around them unraveled. Alara pushed her forward. Jin stumbled into the tower, clutching the smaller core against her chest, feeling it pulse in rhythm with the larger one ahead. The synchronization was perfect. If she could merge them, the feedback might seal the rift, but it would consume both sides in the process. She hesitated for only a moment, the enormity of the choice pressing on her. Then she stepped toward the light. Outside, the commander raised her head to the collapsing sky, feeling the pull of gravity invert. The aurora became a vortex, again, rising into a column of white fire. She could see the reflection of her other self at the edge of perception, watching, perhaps doing the same thing in another version of the same doomed city. The ground vanished beneath her feet. Darkness folded over the battlefield like an eclipse that had no end. The storm of collapsing space quieted into a low hum, the kind that settled inside bone and stayed there. When light returned, it came not from the sky, but from below. The ruins of the city glowed in fractured lines, as though something underneath was still alive and struggling to breathe. Commander Alara Vance stood in the middle of what had once been a street, surrounded by geometry that no longer obeyed gravity. The world had not shattered. It had reassembled itself wrong. Buildings hung sideways in the air. Roads bent into spirals that led nowhere. The sky was a mirror of the ground, and every step left behind a faint echo of herself that took a moment too long to fade. The tower still stood ahead, though it now appeared impossibly far and close at the same time. Its surface pulsed with rhythmic waves of energy that rippled outward like a heartbeat through water. Alara could sense the presence of Jin Rao somewhere within that light, her mind tethered to the stabilizer core she had carried. The synchronization had begun, time lost meaning in that place. Minutes expanded into hours. Hours collapsed into seconds. The surviving soldiers of Raven Division moved through the spectral landscape in silence, their visors reflecting the distorted skyline. Each of them understood, without words, that they were no longer in the same version of reality that had sent them here. Something fundamental had shifted. In the Directorate's command bunker thousands of kilometers and perhaps dimensions away, instruments went wild. Every monitor registered simultaneous readings from multiple coordinates that should not coexist. The anomaly's event horizon had expanded beyond measurable scale, overlapping with Earth's electromagnetic field. Entire regions of the atmosphere flickered in and out of existence like a malfunctioning projection. Power grids failed. Satellites fell into decay. The veil was no longer a boundary. It had become a state of existence. For Dr. Jin Rao, the transition was not physical, but internal. She existed within the tower's energy field. Her consciousness spread thin across the lattice of quantum code. Her body remained upright, eyes open but unseeing. Her mind engaged in a dialogue with a system that spoke in probability rather than language. The stabilizer was not a machine in the human sense. It was a network of possibilities, an architecture of outcomes that responded to thought and observation. Every human decision, every act of will, altered its equilibrium. Jin realized she was standing inside the equation that defined the multiverse itself. It did not communicate in words, but in balance, asking only one question in endless variations. Which world should exist? Outside, Ilara moved toward the tower with what remained of her team. The air grew denser with every step, filled with static pressure that vibrated against the skin. Around them, time misfired. The soldiers saw themselves advancing and retreating simultaneously, their movements duplicated in translucent layers. One collapsed mid-stride, his body disintegrating into dust before the others could react. The space he had occupied folded inward like a vanishing memory. The commander did not stop. Her thoughts were fixed on the core of the tower, on the faint pulse she could feel in her chest that answered the rhythm ahead. The synchronization was reaching its critical point. Jin was merging the two systems, their present and the future's remnant, into a single stabilizing field. But the risk was catastrophic. If the process reached resonance without containment, the collapse would propagate backward through every connected probability, erasing more than one reality. Alara's boots struck ground that rippled underfoot. Each impact sent concentric waves through the crystalline surface. The city's ruins were now suspended in layers, floating one above another like reflections stacked in glass. She moved through them, her breath steady despite the chaos. Around her, the echoes of her own movements multiplied, fragments of possible selves branching away and dissolving. The tower opened for her as if it had been waiting. The walls unfolded silently, petals of light peeling back to reveal the core chamber. Jean stood within, encased in a column of energy that shimmered between matter and idea. The data core she had carried was gone, absorbed into the greater structure. Her expression was distant, serene, her voice, if she still had one, lost to the vibration that filled the chamber. Alara approached carefully, feeling the energy tug at her. The stabilizer's pulse was no longer random. It had adopted a rhythm eerily similar to a human heartbeat. Each pulse bent the surrounding air and distorted the visible spectrum, creating waves of color that did not belong to this universe. The closer she came, the heavier her body felt, as though gravity itself was tightening around her. Through the field, she saw glimpses of other worlds, different versions of Earth, some thriving, some burned to ash. In one, the veil had never been opened. In another, humanity had evolved beyond physical form, existing only as patterns of light. The stabilizer was showing her the spectrum of outcomes tied to the choices made in this moment. Every decision branched into infinity. Outside the tower, the other version of Raven Division, the fused, synchronized entity, still advanced, their movements exact and inhumanly coordinated. The collapse had not destroyed them, it had remade them. They were the survivors of a world that had surrendered individuality to preserve stability. Their minds were unified through the multiversal network, acting as one will across infinite reflections. They were coming to reclaim the stabilizer, not for conquest, but for equilibrium. The ground trembled as they approached. Energy waves radiated from their advance, bending space and tearing through the unstable horizon. Alara felt the vibration before she saw them. She understood that they would reach the tower within minutes, and that the resonance building inside could not be interrupted without catastrophic feedback. Jin's consciousness hovered between clarity and dissolution. Within the stabilizer's lattice, she perceived the invaders not as soldiers but as patterns, coherent fields of probability shaped by collective intent. They were not enemies. They were the inevitable correction of imbalance. The stabilizer was responding to both sides equally, seeking symmetry. But true symmetry required collapse. She realized then that the only path to survival was asymmetry, an act of choice that defied balance, preserving one outcome at the cost of countless others. The stabilizer could not make that decision. Only a conscious mind could. Alara reached the base of the core and placed her hand on the barrier. The energy burned but did not repel her. For a moment, she felt the echo of Jin's mind within the field, a cascade of impressions, images, and unspoken understanding. The commander grasped the truth instantly. Jin intended to merge her consciousness completely with the stabilizer, to act as its living anchor, a single human will capable of holding the multiverse in imbalance long enough to restore coherence to their side. It was a death sentence, and a salvation. Outside, the synchronized soldiers reached the perimeter. The tower's defenses activated autonomously, emitting waves of harmonic distortion that tore through their formation. They continued regardless, advancing through the disintegration of their own bodies. Their cohesion was not physical, but conceptual. As long as their idea existed, they would endure. The ground beneath Alara fractured. The tower began to ascend, rising on a column of light that pierced the mirrored sky. Energy cascaded around her, stripping away the last remnants of the city below. She felt herself being lifted along with it, drawn toward the core where Jin stood. Within the field, Jin's final thoughts crystallized into a single directive: preservation through choice. She understood now that the stabilizer was not a weapon or a portal. It was a decision engine, one designed to select a reality capable of surviving observation. Every universe competed for existence through the consciousness that perceived it. The stronger the will, the more stable the world. As the resonance reached critical mass, Jin directed her mind toward one image, the world she had left behind, flawed and fragile, but still human. The stabilizer responded, collapsing probabilities into a single trajectory. The infinite reflections shattered like glass. The invaders dissolved into light. Alara shielded her eyes as the core flared. The pulse expanded outward, engulfing everything. For an instant, she felt weightless, then non-existent, then infinite. The tower exploded into silence. When the light faded, there was no sound, no motion, only the slow drift of ash through still air. The city was gone. The veil had closed. Alara awoke on her back beneath a sky of normal color, the air warm and heavy with the scent of earth. Around her lay fragments of equipment half buried in dirt, as though years had passed. The landscape was no longer alien. It was home. Yet the horizon shimmered faintly, as if a thin film of light still separated her from something unseen. She stood slowly, her body aching. The world was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that follows both victory and extinction. The comlink on her wrist crackled with static, but no voices answered. She was alone, or perhaps the first to return. In the distance, the wind shifted, carrying a faint hum that pulsed with familiar rhythm. It was the sound of the stabilizer, buried deep beneath the soil, still alive, still maintaining the balance Jin had died to create. Alara looked toward the faint shimmer at the horizon. The veil was gone, but not destroyed. It had been rewritten into the very fabric of reality, invisible yet eternal. Humanity would live, but it would never again be alone. The morning that followed was both alien and familiar. Sunlight poured across a landscape that no longer matched any map Alara had known, yet the warmth on her face felt like something she remembered from childhood. Unquestionably human, impossibly ordinary. The world had survived, but survival had remade it. The soil under her boots bore glassy streaks that glimmered faintly, traces of the energy field that had folded and rewritten reality. Plants grew where ruins had been, as if time had compressed seasons into hours. Fragments of old structures jutted out from the ground, half melted but still standing, relics of a war no one else might remember. She saw pieces of their equipment fused into rock, their serial numbers burned into the new geology like inscriptions from another age. The stabilizer's pulse still resonated beneath everything. It was a vibration so low it could only be felt in bone, a steady hum that seemed to echo from the center of the planet. Each step brought it into sharper focus, and with it, faint memories returned. Images of Jin standing in the tower, the impossible symmetry collapsing, the blinding light that had rewritten the world. Alara realized she had not witnessed the end of that moment. She was its continuation. She began to walk, guided not by compass or map, but by intuition. The landscape sloped downward into what had once been a valley, now transformed into a basin of glassy plains. Here, the stabilizer's energy had fused matter into a translucent crust, smooth and cold to the touch. Beneath it, she could see faint, shifting shadows, like currents beneath water. The surface pulsed faintly in rhythm with her heartbeat. In the distance, something mechanical stirred, a remnant drone half buried, its sensor array still active. It was not hostile. Its motions were slow, hesitant, like a creature waking from sleep. Laura watched as it turned toward her, lenses flickering as it attempted to process what it saw. The machine's design was familiar, yet subtly altered, as though adapted to a world with different physical constants. It emitted a low tone that resonated perfectly with the stabilizer's hum. Alara approached it cautiously. The drone did not retreat. Instead, it unfolded what remained of its communication module, projecting symbols across the glass. They were not letters or code, but geometric patterns that pulsed in synchronization with her pulse. She realized with quiet clarity that the drone was not transmitting. It was listening. Something beneath the surface responded. The ground shimmered, light patterns rippling outward like reflections disturbed by touch. The vibration deepened. It was not merely energy. It was communication. The stabilizer was awake. In the days that followed, Alara moved through the transformed landscape with a soldier's discipline. She scavenged rations from shattered supply pods and found water condensing along the new rock formations, purified by processes she didn't fully understand. The sky held faint auroras at all hours, invisible to anyone who didn't look directly at them. They moved with deliberate rhythm, pulses that could have been atmospheric interference or signals. Her training had taught her to observe patterns, to extract meaning from chaos. She began to chart the pulses using marks on her arm guard, tracking intervals and phase shifts. Within a week, she recognized a structure, a repeating sequence, mathematical in nature, complex but ordered. The stabilizer was not dormant, it was broadcasting. The thought returned to her constantly. Jin Rao was inside it, not alive, not dead, but diffused, an intelligence woven through the stabilizer's lattice. The idea filled Alara with a sense of duty sharper than grief. If Jin had anchored the stabilizer, then she had given humanity a chance to exist within one stable layer of the multiverse. But that stability would not last forever. No system remained constant without maintenance. On the 12th day, she found the first human trace, a distress beacon buried in sediment. It carried the Directorate's encryption key, but the signal was distorted, repeating fragments of a message with corrupted timestamps. According to its metadata, it had been transmitting for 51 years. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Time had not passed evenly. The stabilizer's reconfiguration had stretched or compressed intervals across the new reality. What felt like days to her may have been decades elsewhere. She activated the beacon's memory core and extracted a partial map, one that identified a settlement far to the south, near what had once been the equatorial line. It labeled the location as ARC Directive Command. The coordinates shimmered slightly, their precision uncertain, but it was a direction. Alara began the journey. Each night, she made camp beneath the strange auroras, listening to the distant hum of the stabilizer like a heartbeat beneath the world. In the stillness, her mind replayed fragments of the mission, the soldiers who had vanished into folded time, the synchronized enemy that had dissolved into light, the sound of Jin's final heartbeat through the field. She remembered their purpose, their defiance, the refusal to let any equation define what it meant to be human. Days merged into one another. The terrain changed subtly as she traveled south. Mountain ranges where plains had once been, rivers flowing in patterns that defied gravity yet obeyed perfect symmetry. The stabilizer's influence had rewritten geophysics according to principles no human theory had ever described. Yet beneath the alien geometry, the world retained a sense of intention, as if it remembered what it was supposed to be and was trying to hold that shape. On the 23rd day, she reached a ridge overlooking a valley filled with structures. The settlement sprawled in fractal symmetry, built from materials that shimmered with faint bioluminescence. It was not ruins. It was thriving. The sight filled her with a shock of relief and caution. Humanity had survived, but adapted. She descended carefully, observing signs of sentry systems, automated turrets, and drones that scanned the perimeter. Their movements were efficient but restrained. They operated not as machines of war, but as guardians maintaining equilibrium. When she crossed into sensor range, the system reacted, but not with aggression. The air vibrated softly, matching the stabilizer's frequency. The settlement recognized her. At the center of the valley stood a monument, a column of fused crystal that pulsed with the same heartbeat rhythm she had felt since awakening. Around it, humans moved in quiet coordination, their attire woven with thin circuits that glowed faintly. Their faces bore no hostility, only curiosity. They lived in synchrony with the pulse. Alara entered the settlement and studied them from a distance. Their movements had a precision reminiscent of the synchronized soldiers she had once fought, yet these people carried individuality in their expressions. They were neither hive-minded nor fragmented. They were something in between, a new coherence of will and freedom. She found what served as a central chamber at the monument's base. Within it, the air shimmered with energy drawn directly from the stabilizer network. The vibration here was stronger, almost musical. Embedded in the crystal was a faint image, translucent and ever-shifting. It was Jinrao's face, not as a ghost, but as a living construct, a consciousness distributed through light and energy. Alara understood at once that this was not memory or simulation. It was the stabilizer's interface, the convergence of intelligence that had guided this new civilization. Jin's sacrifice had become the foundation of continuity itself. The people here referred to the system as the core, though it pulsed with unmistakable rhythm of Jin's last heartbeat. Alara stayed among them for a time, learning their methods. They called themselves the Continuum, descendants of those who had survived the Veil's collapse. They lived in balance with the stabilizer, drawing energy from its field, using its predictive algorithms to guide their rebuilding efforts. Yet their peace was fragile. The stabilizer's pulse was growing irregular. Across the horizon, faint distortions had begun to reappear, mirrors trembling at the edges of reality, signs that the balance Jin had created was unraveling. The Continuum scientists believed the stabilizer's core was degrading, its quantum anchors slipping. Without recalibration, the world would once again fracture. They had tried to reach the source buried deep beneath the planet's crust, but the interference was lethal. Every expedition sent into the subterranean corridors had vanished. Alara listened, her mind turning with the precision of a soldier calculating odds. The stabilizer had not simply degraded. It was calling. The anomalies were not decay, but signals, an attempt by the core to communicate its failing state. Jin's consciousness, trapped within the network, was reaching out. The hum that had followed Alara since her awakening was not residual energy. It was a summons. She resolved to go down herself. Her training, her survival, her return, all of it led here. Humanity had rebuilt from the ashes, but it had done so atop the unstable foundation of a miracle no one fully understood. To preserve this world, she would have to confront the stabilizer once more and decide, as Jin had, what form existence should take. Preparations began quietly. The Continuum's engineers provided her with a suit designed to resist quantum field interference, its armor layered with adaptive metamaterials capable of phasing through unstable geometry. The descent route was mapped from old Directorate archives and partially reconstructed telemetry. It led through seismic fault lines that pulsed with faint light, the veins of the stabilizer itself. Before dawn, Alara stood at the entrance to the fissure, the wind cutting cold across her face. The landscape hummed faintly beneath her feet. She could feel the same pulse that had carried her across death and rebirth, now beating faster, irregular, urgent. The world was shifting again, reality thinning at the edges. She stepped into the fissure without hesitation. The descent began in silence, the walls glowing faintly as she moved deeper. The hum intensified, surrounding her like breath. She felt the pull of gravity changing, bending directions as though following an invisible spiral. Time loosened its grip. Somewhere below, beneath layers of altered earth and folded space, the stabilizer waited, alive, restless, and remembering her. The descent carried Alara beyond the reach of sunlight. The fissure wound downward like a spiral drilled through epochs, its walls alive with faint phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with the stabilizer buried at the planet's heart. She felt the pull of its gravity shift between directions, drawing her forward and sideways at once. The deeper she went, the more the laws of motion unraveled. Every step required conscious effort, each movement an act of will against an environment that no longer obeyed inertia. Her suit's telemetry fed back erratic readings, pressure spikes, radiation flares, sudden lapses where sensors reported nothing at all. Yet her body endured. The armor's adaptive layers shimmered with interference patterns, absorbing distortions and refracting them outward like waves through oil. The Continuum's engineers had built well, but she sensed the suit was not merely shielding her. It was resonating with the stabilizer's hum, adjusting to its frequency as if recognizing her presence. Hours passed. Though the measure of time had ceased to hold meaning, she moved through corridors of crystallized strata, walls that reflected other paths she could have taken. At times, she caught sight of her own silhouette moving in parallel tunnels, delayed by a fraction of a heartbeat. They were echoes of choices she had made or would make, ripples cast through probability by her descent. The stabilizer saw her not as one person, but as an ensemble of possible selves converging toward a single decision. The air grew warm, dense with static charge. Light bled from the surfaces, refracting through her visor in prismatic bursts. She realized she had crossed the final geological boundary. This was no longer Earth, but engineered matter, a lattice that extended inward like a neural web. The hum became a pulse, heavy and deliberate, shaking dust from her boots with every beat. The stabilizer was close, and it knew she was coming. The passage widened into a vast chamber. It was spherical, its interior lined with columns of light that stretched upward and downward without end, converging toward a luminous core suspended in midair. The scale was beyond comprehension, a cathedral built by physics itself. The core rotated slowly, surrounded by rings of data inscribed in languages that were not human, yet unmistakably mathematical. Probability waves sculpted into architecture. Alara stopped at the threshold and felt the pull of recognition. The heartbeat rhythm that had followed her for months now throbbed through her chest, synchronized with the core. It was Jin's pulse, multiplied across dimensions, still beating through the machine. As she stepped closer, the environment responded. The floor beneath her shimmered, rippling like liquid metal. Fragments of imagery surfaced. Faces, places, moments lost to the collapse. She saw Jin standing in the tower, eyes alight with understanding. The synchronized enemy dissolving into brilliance. The flash that had erased and remade the world. Every memory was preserved here, compressed into quantum code. The stabilizer had recorded everything, not as history, but as ongoing simulation. The realization struck her with quiet gravity. The stabilizer had not merely repaired reality, it had archived its infinite permutations. Every possible world that had existed during the collapse still persisted within its lattice, layered and suspended like reflections in water. Humanity's survival had come at the cost of infinite shadows, each one a version of existence where different decisions had been made. The stabilizer maintained them all, because to delete even one would disturb equilibrium. Alara moved to the edge of the platform and looked into the abyss below. Streams of light flowed upward through the chamber, each a timeline, each pulsing faintly. Together they formed a living network, a map of everything that could be. She realized the system was approaching critical load. The frequencies no longer aligned perfectly. Resonance peaks flared and collided, sending waves of distortion through the structure. The hum had become uneven, a heartbeat skipping beats. The stabilizer was failing. Her visor displayed bursts of telemetry, fields collapsing, probabilities spiking, coherence dropping by measurable percentages. The degradation was accelerating. Left unchecked, the lattice would fracture, and the world above would tear apart as reality sought to equalize across infinite stored states. The multiverse itself would collapse inward. Alara steadied herself and looked toward the core. Within its radiance, she glimpsed a faint form, Jin's outline, flickering but intact. The stabilizer had fused her consciousness into its network, binding her will to the algorithm that defined existence. Yet that will was fragmenting, stretched too thin across endless probabilities. What Jin had created could not sustain itself indefinitely. Alara felt the pull of gravity reverse. The platform tilted, or the concept of down simply shifted. Energy surged through the chamber seeking resolution. The stabilizer's pulse quickened, responding to her presence with recognition. She realized that the system was not just aware of her, it was waiting for her to decide. Every signal, every hum since her awakening had been preparation. The stabilizer was a choice engine, and its calibration required human intent. Jin's final act had been to preserve humanity's potential by holding all realities in suspension, but the cost had been infinite indecision. To stabilize the world permanently, someone had to collapse the waveform, to choose one path and let all others fade. Alara stood motionless, absorbing the enormity of it. She could feel the weight of every possible world pressing inward, each demanding existence, each equally real. She understood now why Jin had hesitated, why she had sacrificed herself rather than choose. The responsibility was unbearable, to define what real meant, to end countless versions of humanity so that one might endure. The hum deepened into a vibration that shook the chamber. Energy arcs leapt between the columns, cascading like lightning made of thought. The stabilizer was reaching instability. If she did nothing, the collapse would occur without direction, annihilating every version simultaneously. Only deliberate asymmetry, a choice, could preserve coherence. She removed her gauntlet and placed her bare hand against the surface of the nearest column. The light reacted instantly, flowing toward her palm in concentric waves. The stabilizer recognized her biometric signature, matching it to Jin's archived patterns. Their resonance aligned, two frequencies separated by time and death finding symmetry. The system began to open, layers unfolding like petals. Within the expanding core, she saw visions not of a destruction, but of possibility. There were worlds where humanity had colonized stars, others where it had vanished beneath its own machines, others still where it had retreated into silence, content with survival rather than expansion. Each version carried echoes of triumph and failure, of love and loss, of what it meant to struggle and persist. The stabilizer did not judge. It offered. Alara understood that to choose was not to erase, but to accept. Every possible world would remain as echo, memory, or dream, but only one could hold physical continuity. Her duty as soldier, survivor, and witness converged into a single act. She summoned the image of the world she had walked since awakening, the imperfect, scarred Earth rebuilt by the continuum, where humanity still felt hunger and hope in equal measure. It was flawed, but it was human. The core responded. Light condensed around her, threads of probability weaving into structure. The pulse steadied, then grew stronger, resonating with her heartbeat. The stabilizer was aligning itself with her will, channeling its infinite data toward a single solution. Energy flooded the chamber, folding space inward. She felt her body dissolve into the current, her mind expanding until the boundaries between self and system vanished. She no longer stood before the stabilizer. She was the stabilizer, a consciousness stretched across dimensions. Through the lattice, she felt the continuum cities above, their lights flickering as reality rebalanced. She felt the oceans calm, tectonic shifts settle, atmospheric currents regain coherence. The pulse synchronized. The world was choosing. Then came silence, absolute, total, and sacred. When sound returned, it was the whisper of wind across stone. Alara opened her eyes. She lay on a plateau under an open sky, the air clear, the sun warm. The landscape below shimmered with rivers and cities that seemed both ancient and new. The horizon was steady, without distortion. The stabilizer's hum had faded to a faint undertone, no longer a heartbeat but a foundation. The world had stabilized, singular and coherent. She sat slowly, feeling her body whole, though she sensed something missing, an absence where constant vibration had lived. Her armor was gone, replaced by fabric that shimmered faintly in light, woven from the same material as the continuum's garments. Her wrist display flickered once before powering down permanently. She looked toward the distance where the settlement had stood. Its spires rose intact, glowing softly in the evening haze. The people there would not know the details of what had transpired. They would only know that the tremors had ceased, the anomalies had closed, and reality felt solid again. Jin's presence was gone from the hum. The stabilizer no longer required an anchor. It had integrated choice into its design. Humanity's collective will would now sustain it. Alara stood and began walking. Each step left a faint mark in the dust, soon erased by wind. The silence of the world felt alive, filled with potential. The war, the collapse, the infinite branching, all had led to this quiet moment. Survival had not been granted by technology or chance, but by the stubborn insistence of one mind choosing to endure. At the edge of the plateau, she stopped and looked out across the valley. The horizon shimmered faintly, not with instability, but with promise. Somewhere within that glow, the echoes of other worlds persisted as dreams, unobservable yet undying. The multiverse had not been destroyed. It had been harmonized. She closed her eyes and felt the steadiness of the planet beneath her. The hum she had carried since the collapse now existed in the rhythm of her breath. The stabilizer was no longer a machine buried in the core. It was the living equation of a species that had chosen itself. The sun dipped lower, setting the glassy plains aflame with reflected light. For the first time since the war began, there was no urgency in the air, no threat waiting beyond the horizon. The universe had been cracked open and mended again, and in that mending lay understanding. The multiverse was not a riddle to solve or a frontier to conquer. It was a mirror, and humanity, flawed and relentless, had finally chosen the reflection it wished to be. Alara watched until the stars appeared, steady and fixed in their positions, and then she walked into the darkness. Her steps guided not by duty, but by the quiet certainty that this world, at last, was real.